Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. My first comment is to point out that in her 2019 presidential campaign, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat, called for the breaking up of your companies. Several weeks ago, in his speech at CPAC, Senator Josh Hawley, Republican, also said that big tech companies should be broken up. I don't think I need to point out the irony of Josh Hawley validating Elizabeth Warren at CPAC. There seems to be a train wreck coming. Unfortunately, the very few tools that we have in our tool bag are regulation and breaking up. Mr. Zuckerberg, I read through your terms of service, including the dense community standards document. In your terms of service, you state that you cannot control and do not take responsibility for content posted on your platform. The community standards document, which is frequently cited as why content is or is not censored, says you sometimes make content moderation decisions based off what's considered best for the public interest or public discourse. I know in your testimony you said that companies need to earn their liability protections. That's great, but that doesn't address the concerns people understandably share about your past or current views on what is or is not acceptable. How do you claim you cannot take responsibility and therefore should maintain your liability protections for content posted on your site, but at the same time state that your platform will monitor content based off what's in the public's best interest? That appears to be two-sided.
Congressman, thanks. People use our services to share and send messages billions of times a day. And it would be impossible for us to scan or understand everything that was going on. And I don't think that our society would want us to take the steps that would be necessary to monitor every single thing. I think that we would think that would infringe on our freedoms. So broadly, I think it's impossible to ask companies to take responsibility for every single piece of content that someone posts. And that, I think, is the wisdom of 230. At the same time, I do think that we should expect large platforms to have effective systems for being able to handle, broadly speaking, categories of content that are clearly illegal. So we've talked today about child exploitation and opioids and sex trafficking and things like that. And I think it's reasonable that to expect that companies have systems that are broadly effective, even if they're not going to be exactly perfect, and there are still going to be some pieces of content that inevitably get through, just like no police department in a city is going to be able to eliminate all crime.
I've got to jump in only because we're out of time. I would love to spend more time on that with you. Let me also ask you, Utah is known for Silicon Slopes, our startup community. You've called for government regulation, but some view this with skepticism because larger companies tend to deal with regulation much better than small companies. If you think back to your college days, the early startup phase of Facebook, what challenges do you see for startups to compete, and what cautions should Congress consider as we look at regulation that potentially could be a barrier for companies that just might be your future competition?
Thanks. I think that this is a really important point whenever we're talking about regulation. And I want to be clear that the recommendations that I'm making for Section 230, I would only have apply to larger platforms. I think it's really critical that a small platform, the next student in a dorm room or in a garage, needs to have a relatively low as possible regulatory burden in order to be able to innovate and then get to the scale where they can afford to put those kind of systems in place. So I think that that's a really important point to make. But I think that goes for the content discussions that we're having around 230. It probably also applies to the privacy law that I hope that Congress will pass in this year or next year to create a federal U.S. privacy standard. And I also think that we should be exploring proactively requiring things like data portability that would make it easier for people to take data from one service to another.
Thank you. I've got just a few seconds left. And Mr. Pichai, this is a little bit off topic, so I'm simply going to ask this question and submit it for the record and not ask for a response. Almost a decade ago, your company started Google Fiber. You introduced gig speed and free internet to all the residents of my home city, Provo, Utah. Sadly, it seems like your efforts to do this across the country were slowed down or even stopped by excessive government regulations. I'd love you to share off the record, and I'll submit it for the record, why government is making it so hard to expand internet across the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield my time.